Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're talking about Captain William Kidd. I know a lot of you are interested in his story, and believe me, it is a crazy one. We're going to move past the typical pirate stuff, like less about peg legs and parrots, more about like political drama and tough choices.
Yeah, it's a story that really makes you think.
For this deep dive, we're using an episode from the American History Tellers podcast, Season 51, Episode 2. It's called Pirates, Captain Kidd's Adventure. And we're going to figure out how a guy hired to hunt pirates became one himself.
It really is a fascinating story, and to understand it, we have to remember the historical context.
Yeah, sure.
Captain Kidd lived during the golden age of piracy, but there was also a war going on, King William's War, England versus France. It was a messy time.
Totally. It adds a whole other layer to the story.
Absolutely. And it helps us see how a respected sailor could end up breaking the law.
Okay, so let's jump in. The podcast starts with Kidd's early life in Scotland. He was basically obsessed with ships from a very young age, but he wasn't exactly like a kind, gentle sea captain.
Yeah.
He was a tough guy, known for his size and his temper.
Yeah, he definitely had a temper. And you know, it's interesting.
What's that?
Those qualities that we might see as negative now,
Yeah.
they were actually pretty valuable back then.
Oh.
That was a rough world, especially in the Caribbean, where Kidd ended up as a privateer.
Okay. This is where things get tricky. Explain what a privateer is.
A privateer was basically a pirate, but with permission from the government.
Wait a minute. Are you telling me that governments were hiring pirates to attack their enemies?
Yeah.
That sounds kind of messed up.
It does sound crazy, right? But in the 17th century, that was totally normal.
Okay.
It was a cheap way for countries to fight wars.
Right.
They could weaken their enemies
Yeah.
without having to spend a ton of money on their navies.
So they'd hire these private ships.
Exactly. These private ship owners would get what were called letters of marque, which were basically permission slips to capture enemy ships,
Oh, so it was all legal.
technically.
Yeah.
And they got to keep the cargo from the ships they captured,
So it was a win-win for the governments and the privateers.
at least in theory.
Okay, so Kidd starts out as a privateer.
Yeah.
But how does he go from that to being labeled a pirate? Did he just get greedy?
Well, the line between privateering and piracy was always blurry,
Right.
especially in the Caribbean.
Of course.
There was a lot of opportunity to bend the rules.
Yeah, I bet.
Plus, Kidd had seen a lot of violence and shifting loyalties early in his career.
Yeah,
That probably shaped how he saw the world,
right.
which is important when we get to the mutiny on the Salt Rose,
Yeah.
a French privateer ship.
Oh, yeah, the mutiny. That's where everything changes, right? This happened when England and France went to war.
Exactly.
Suddenly, Kidd was a Scottish guy on a French ship. Not a good place to be.
Definitely. It must have been tense on that ship.
Yeah, I bet.
The English sailors, including Kidd, they knew they were in danger.
Right.
And remember, Kidd was a man of action.
Uh-huh.
He was decisive and some might say ruthless.
So it was like a kill or be killed situation?
Basically, the mutiny took control of the ship, killed some of the French crew.
That's intense.
It was brutal. But here's the thing. This mutiny actually helped Kidd's reputation.
Wait, really? Mutiny helped him. I don't get it.
I know. It sounds strange. But remember, it was wartime.
Yeah.
People admired ruthlessness back then.
Yeah.
Kidd was seen as a leader, someone who could take charge, even if it meant using violence.
So he became Captain Kidd after the mutiny.
Yeah.
Wow. And what about the ship?
He renamed it the Blessed William.
So even though he committed mutiny and murder, it was like a weird promotion.
It shows how different things were back then.
Yeah.
It was a chaotic time.
Right.
Ambition and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. Those were qualities that could get you ahead.
So after all that drama, I think you would want a quiet life.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But Captain Kidd, he was never one to stay in one place for too long.
So he tries to settle down. Right. In New York City, gets married, builds this amazing house. Even has his own pew in church.
Yeah, it sounds like the perfect life.
You think he'd be happy?
You'd think so.
Right.
Right. But he couldn't resist the call of the sea.
I guess once you've had a taste of adventure,
Yeah.
it's hard to go back to a normal life.
Exactly. And there are all these stories going around about a new opportunity, this thing called the pirate round.
The pirate round, what was that?
Imagine the ships sailing all the way to Africa and Arabia, loaded with all this amazing stuff, spices, silks, jewels, things that were really hard to get in the colonies, especially with the war still going on.
Oh, so it was like a prime target for pirates.
Exactly. Trade routes were disrupted, so there was this huge black market for exotic goods.
I see. So it was like a pirate superhighway. just waiting to be plundered.
And for a guy like Kidd, who loved the sea and the thrill of the chase,
Yeah.
the temptation must have been overwhelming. Almost like riches,
Right.
adventure, hard to resist, I bet.
Especially compared to a normal life.
So that's where Lord Bellamont comes in, right?
Right. He was the governor of New York.
And he had a serious pirate problem on his hands. Piracy was disrupting trade, causing all sorts of headaches.
Makes sense. So he needed someone to deal with it.
Exactly. And he thought Captain Kidd was the man for the job.
The kid was a former pirate himself.
A privateer.
Right, a privateer. How do you convince a guy like that to hunt down his own kind?
Well, there were some powerful people pulling strings behind the scenes.
Huh?
Kidd was connected to Robert Livingston.
Oh, yeah, Livingston was a big deal in New York, right?
Huge. He was a Scotsman-like kid, and he had a lot of political influence.
I see.
So Livingston convinces Bellamont that Kidd is the perfect guy for the job.
What was his argument?
He said that Kidd understood how pirates operated.
Because he used to be one.
Exactly. He knew their tricks, so he'd be better at catching them.
That's actually a pretty good point.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
So they offered Kidd a deal he couldn't refuse.
What kind of deal?
They gave him a powerful new ship, the Adventure Galley.
Wow.
And they gave him 2 commissions.
2.
One to hunt down English pirates, and the other to capture French ships in the Indian Ocean.
So basically he was a privateer again.
Kind of, but the stakes were much higher this time.
How so?
The East India Company's trade was being threatened.
Oh, wow.
This was a big deal.
Yeah,
International implications.
right.
If Kidd succeeded, he'd be rich and powerful. But if he failed, the consequences could be devastating.
It sounds like they set him up to fail.
It does seem that way. And to make matters worse, the voyage was a disaster from the start.
Really? What happened?
Ship repairs, crew deaths from disease, low morale.
Oh, that's rough.
It was a tough journey.
Yeah, I bet.
And Kidd was under so much pressure to get results.
Because of his commission.
Yeah, he was working under a no-pray, no-pay system.
What does that mean?
It means if he didn't capture any ships,
Yeah.
his crew wouldn't get paid.
Oh, so they could mutiny.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was in a really tough spot.
So what did he do?
Well, that brings us to the most controversial part of Captain Kidd's story.
What happened?
Instead of hunting down real pirates, he started attacking ships that weren't actually pirate ships.
He went rogue.
He did. Why? Was it greed? Desperation? A little bit of both?
I don't know. It's hard to say.
Whatever the reason. He crossed the line.
So what did he do?
One of his most controversial targets was a ship called the Quetta Merchant,
The Quetta Merchant.
owned by, you're not going to believe this, the East India Company?
No way. The very company he was supposed to be protecting.
The very same.
Talk about irony.
It's incredible.
So how did he get away with it?
He used a clever but dishonest tactic.
What was it?
He would demand to see the French papers of the ships he captured.
Work papers.
Yeah, like
Huh.
permission slips to sail in French waters.
Right.
But most merchant ships back then, they carried passes from multiple countries.
Right.
So if a ship had French papers,
Yeah.
Kidd would claim they were an enemy ship.
Even if they weren't really.
Exactly. It was a flimsy excuse.
Yeah.
But it allowed him to take their cargo.
So Captain Kidd, the pirate hunter.
He became a pirate himself.
Wow. What a story.
And it gets even crazier.
How so?
Word of his piracy spread like wildfire.
Of course.
He realized he was in deep trouble.
Yeah.
So he tried to negotiate his way out.
What did he do?
He wrote letters to Lord Bellamont.
The governor.
Yeah, claiming he was innocent.
Really?
He said his crew forced him into piracy.
So he was trying to spin the story.
He was playing the victim.
That's a risky move.
It was. And here's where Lord Bellamont's role gets really interesting.
What do you mean?
By this point, Bellamont didn't want to protect Kidd anymore.
Why not?
He actually had a lot to gain from seeing Kidd convicted.
Oh, I see.
There's a big reward for capturing a famous pirate.
Right.
Much bigger than the reward for just doing the original mission.
So Bellamont kind of set a trap for Kidd.
It seems that way. He told Kidd to sail to Boston for a hearing.
Right.
Promised to help him get a pardon.
Got it.
When Kidd arrived in Boston,
Yeah.
he was arrested immediately.
Wow.
The political climate had changed.
How so?
Piracy wasn't something they could ignore anymore.
Right.
The East India Company was furious.
They had a right to be.
Even the Mughal emperor.
Who's that?
He ruled over India.
Okay.
The Quetta Merchant had been sailing from his territory.
I see.
He was demanding justice.
So they needed someone to blame.
They needed a scapegoat.
And Kidd was the perfect target.
He was abandoned by his powerful friends.
Left to face the music.
Exactly.
So Kidd's arrested.
Right.
Yeah, abandoned by all those powerful people. and facing some serious charges. What happened at his trial?
Well, he was sent to London and put on trial for piracy and murder.
And what did he say? Did he confess?
Nope. He kept insisting he was innocent.
Really?
Throughout the whole trial, he claimed he'd been following his commission
Uh-huh.
and that his crew had made him turn to piracy.
So he was still playing the victim.
Pretty much. And he even tried to use those French passes he collected as evidence. But there was a problem.
What happened? Did he lose them?
They vanished. Mysteriously.
Vanished. What do you mean?
Nobody knows for sure what happened to them, but some historians think that Bellamont,
The governor?
yeah, or someone working for him, made sure those passes never made it to court.
Why would they do that?
Because those passes were the only proof. Kid had to back up his story without them.
He was doomed.
Exactly. It was like he was set up to fail.
It's a pretty messed up story.
It is, and it shows how far people in power would go to protect themselves.
Yeah. So what happened at the trial?
Without those passes, the jury found Kid guilty. He was sentenced to death by hanging.
That's a rough ending.
It is. But, his story doesn't end there.
What do you mean?
Even after he was executed, Captain Kidd's legend lived on.
How so?
People couldn't stop talking about his buried treasure.
Oh, yeah. The treasure.
Remember he buried some of his loot on Gardiner's Island before sailing to Boston?
Right.
Well, stories about that buried treasure have been around for centuries.
Wow.
People are still searching for it today, convinced that there's a fortune waiting to be found.
That's incredible.
It is. It just goes to show how powerful a good treasure story can be.
It's like everyone wants to believe in buried riches.
Exactly. But beyond the treasure, Captain Kidd's story tells us a lot about history, about the golden age of piracy.
Right. So what does it tell us?
Well, for one thing, it reminds us that history is rarely black and white.
Huh?
It's full of moral dilemmas and people caught in the middle. Captain Kidd was a complicated guy. He was a product of his time.
And a victim of circumstance.
Maybe. It's hard to say for sure, but his story definitely makes us think about the choices people make when they're under pressure and the forces that shape our destinies.
That's deep.
It is. And it also sheds light on a dark side of colonialism.
How so?
Remember, this was a time when European powers were competing for control of trade routes and territories.
Yeah.
They exploited people and resources and created a system that led to things like piracy.
So guys like Captain Kidd were just pawns in a bigger game.
In a way, yes. They were used by the powerful and then discarded when they were no longer needed.
That's pretty messed up.
It is. But it's important to remember that history isn't just about the powerful. It's also about the ordinary people who got caught up in the events of their time.
Right. And sometimes those ordinary people did extraordinary things.
Exactly, like Captain Kidd. He wasn't perfect.
To say the least.
Right, he made some bad choices. But his story is a reminder that even the most notorious figures have a human side.
And their stories deserve to be told.
Absolutely. So there you have it. The story of Captain Kidd. A tale of adventure, betrayal, and the enduring power of myth and legend.
It's been a wild ride.
It has. But we've reached the end of our deep dive. I hope you enjoyed it.
I know I did. I learned a lot about Captain Kidd and the golden age of piracy.
Me too. And I hope this deep dive inspired you to learn more about history.
Yeah. There's so much out there to discover.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe you'll even uncover a lost treasure of your own.
That's all for today. Thanks for listening.
And until next time, keep exploring and keep those adventurous spirits alive.